Sermon Smash!
Hey everyone, welcome to Sermon Smash Bros. This is Michael Poff.
And this is Matthew Jones. Sermon Smash Bros. Is a podcast where preachers are invited to deconstruct their sermons right before your very ears. Michael, episode 1, are you pumped?
I am.
Me too, so excited. Who's on the show today?
Jake Edwards is on the show. He is from New Beginnings Church of the Nazarene.
That's great. We sat down with Jake at General Assembly.
That's right. We sat down in a hallway in one of the many hallways of the Indianapolis Conference Center.
Yeah, it was very good. Lots of people walking by, had big headphones on. It was very fun, though. And it's a great interview. I took a lot away from this personally. I learned about preaching from Pastor Jake, and I think he has a lot to share with all of our listeners. So without further ado, Jake Edwards. Hi, and welcome to the Sermon Smash Bros. Today we have Pastor Jake Edwards. Welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. So we'd like to start out by having you just share kind of the big move of your sermon. Tell us what you're drawing from, what text, and kind of where you're taking your people in this time.
Yep. So we just got done with a sermon series on the vision of the church. Felt like the Easter season was a great season to talk about new things and where we're headed in the new vision in my first year in this church, finishing my first year in that church. And so this now starts after Pentecost, the ordinary season, and we're back into the lectionary. And the lectionary passages we're drawn from are the Old Testament passages, and so we're in Genesis for the rest of ordinary, not for the rest of ordinary season, but for the rest of the summer. We're using the Genesis passages. And so for that week, we're in the promise to Abraham and Sarah that they'll be having a son. So Genesis 18, the first 15 verses of Genesis 18, and then chapter 21, verses 1 through 5.
Great. So out of that text, then, what does the message become?
Yeah, so that's kind of developed over the week. Of course, we started the week prior to that was Genesis chapter 1, just the whole creation story. And so what the message became is this connection to this God that speaks, this God that has a word, that when God speaks this word, it forms and shapes and produces very good promises.
Yeah, great.
So concerning preparation, where do you start and what is your first step with preparing a sermon or even this sermon?
Yeah. So the first step, I try to use Lectio Divina as a preparation that guides me through the whole week. And so not just necessarily one session of it, but using it as it unfolds throughout the whole week. And
yeah, if someone's listening that isn't familiar with Lectio Divina, would you just take a brief moment and share kind of what that is?
Yeah, so it's a sacred way of reading and praying through the text that comes to us through centuries of practice through the church. And there's 4 stages involved in Lectio. There's the reading, then there's a meditation part, and then there's a praying, and then a contemplation part. And so the way I use it for sermon preparation, and lately what I've been doing is I've been beginning with brief exegesis on my own. When I first started using this practice, I started out just with Lectio Divina of reading the text and then sitting and meditating through the text, and then having a time of silence and prayer, letting God and the Spirit of God breathe this text back over me before I ever went into any sort of exegesis or search through the commentaries. Well, lately what I've been doing, and I like it better this way, is I get pretty familiar with the text. Sometimes when I'm preaching through the lectionary, I'm not ready to preach through that text without any type of sitting with it for a while. So lately I'll use Monday to get familiar with the text, even to consult some commentaries and things, just to kind of get my my hands on it and get my feet wet with the text a little bit, and then I'll move into a time of the Lectio Divina and read through the text aloud, and sometimes I'll even record it. And so on my iPhone or something, and I'll read through it aloud and let the words sit with me. And then I'll play it back and I'll listen to the text being read over me. And then I'll read it sometimes again, sometimes 3 or 4 times, and asking God then in meditation, what words are coming to me in this text, and then what words should be or might be coming to my congregation. What is being exposed in this reading that my congregation needs to hear? And so I'll kind of do the Lectio Divina over my congregation, praying and meditating, contemplating, taking time to listen to the needs and heart and the flow of my congregation. And so using this as a process of sermon preparation. It's really been great. And so for this particular text, it's the laughing bit. It's where, and so if you're listening to the podcast, go read Genesis 18. You may need to read Genesis 17 before, but Abraham laughs at God, this God that speaks a promise, and then Sarah takes her turn, and she laughs. And this whole time, I'm caught by this interaction. It's a very playful interaction, and it's a narrative that's very engaging in Genesis. And then by chapter 21, she has the baby, and her response, of course, is to name the baby exactly what God said that she would name him, which is laughter. Isaac means laughter. And so this laughter has now transitioned from this senile, you crazy God, you have no idea who you're speaking to. You don't know these barren bones. They can't produce a baby. Almost like this sinister laugh. Like, there's no way that this... And in this cruelty, too. How dare you, God? How dare you come to a barren woman and talk to me about childbirth? Like, how dare you post that on Facebook when you know I can't have a baby? This laughter of, I cannot believe you went there. Well, this laughter transitions in John chapter 21, or not John, in Genesis chapter 21, to be a laughter of joy. Man, this caught me. And this caught me for where my congregation particularly is in trying to lean into what we believe God has led us to do at Lee Summit New Beginnings in Lee Summit, Missouri, and where God is leading us to, sometimes met with this laughter that's not necessarily joyous, this laughter that is more maybe even mocking, like, are you kidding me? We can't do that. Do you not know what we're able to do? This laughter of limitations, like, this, Pastor, you can't be talking about us, to one day being a laughter of fulfillment, like, holy cow, can you believe what God just did with this little group? Like, what God did through this little small section of a church, that God used us. Can you believe it? I know. Well, you didn't bring me on here to preach.
No, it's great.
Yeah, it's so the very simple question of where did you begin with this text? Well, I begin with reading it and letting it be read over me, and it's the laughter part that stuck out to me.
Yeah, I love that, allowing the text to be read over yourself before you can let it be read over your community. I think that's just wonderful. That's great. In your preparation, do you have any sort of rituals? Is there a certain place you go? Is there a certain thing you need to be eating or drinking as you prepare? Like, what's your routine?
Yeah, my routine to living is to drink coffee. And so yes, I feel like every time I sit down to read or to prepare, I don't feel comfortable until I have a cup of coffee. And I don't know if that's a good thing or if that's something that maybe God is leading me to give up. I don't know. Maybe I'm becoming too dependent upon it. I've tried staying at home and locking myself in my basement and trying to be kind of comfortable there, and that's worked sometimes. Sometimes it's my office. Sometimes I've driven out to a park. whatever it is for me, the common denominator is I need to be at a place where I'm comfortable, where I can be creative. Never was a very good student. Homework does not come to me naturally. That's just not me. I'm very intuitive. I'm very creative, and I need a place where I can. And I'm emotional. Oh my gosh, I'm so emotional. I am a drama king. If you've ever met one, it's me. I'm a very emotional guy. I need a place where I can go and feel things and get in touch with my emotions, and from that place create and talk and speak aloud. I need to talk out loud, and so I'm an extrovert and I like to be around people, but in sermon prep, sometimes it's not good for me to be around people because I need to be speaking. I need to be talking.
So, where do you draw inspiration from? Are there a specific, is there a specific resource you use, or an author that you like, or maybe music you listen to? I don't. Yeah. So where
jazz. I like jazz music, and that's not all the time, but I have found that's good for me. For the Genesis series, it's Walter Brueggemann, and so a specific author for this series, at least, is I'm in touch with what the scholar is writing and how he's writing, but it just varies from sermon to sermon or series to series. But I would say music is, for at least for the creative sides of my sermons. Music gets me thinking. Movies does the same thing, but that's not like I don't sit down and do that forever. It just kind of as the spirit leads. Is
there a commentary that Walter wrote, or something?
So I would say for anyone wanting to do some more reading, it's the Interpretation series.
Okay.
And you could read that book as a devotional, to be honest with you. And you could also use it for great preparation too. But what Dr. Brueggemann is saying in his commentary, I feel like is greatly formational for the church.
It's great. It's great. So tell us a little bit more about how you shared this sermon, and so specifically, how is it responding theologically to the needs of your community in this place and time?
Yeah, so I kind of hinted on that. I'm in a context in which we have experienced vast transition over the last 5 years. One of those transitions being moving from a building that we built ourselves and that we owned, and having to give that up because of debt. And so that's that was hard. That was a pride point for some. We built this building, and then to have to own the fact that they couldn't afford it, and that they were kind of slaves to debt, and selling that and moving into the opposite of what they built. They built the Taj Mahal of churches, not quite, but it was a beautiful building, and it was new, and it was theirs, and it was custom, and they created it. They moved from that to a dilapidated, broke down strip mall in a dilapidated, broke down part of town, which wasn't far from their original building, but it was removed just a mile down the road, but removed enough to let them know they were in a different type of neighborhood, and the building was falling apart. And this is where they moved from. They moved from this really nice building to this really broke down building, asking themselves, can any good thing come from here? This really was a question of our people. Can any good thing come from here? Well, in the process of all of that, the church essentially split in half. And so they lost half the people, and that was significant for us, and we lost right at about half the funds as well. And so our church went from this booming, growing young church to a church jaded by hurt and by some bad decisions. And they had pain, and they were asking themselves, can any good thing come from us? Can any good thing come from here? And then right before I got there, obviously, they lost their pastor. And there was some pain, and there was some hurt there. And I feel like one of the things that I've been learning about our people is just kind of in some ways a story of shame. Can any good thing come from come from me, can I produce? Am I able to produce any good thing? Or is everything that I produce broken? Is everything I touch crumble? So what is this sermon trying to do? Well, I could be wrong. I'm just trying to be faithful in the pastor's heart. But I intuitively sense, as I get to know the story of these people, that what they need to hear is that what God said he will do, he will indeed do. This is a text in Genesis 21:1.
Yeah.
And God, along the lines of, then God said to Sarah, or Sarah realized, God did exactly what he said he would do. That there'll be laughter in this story, and it will be laughter out of joy because God will do with new beginnings what God said he would do. And so what you hear in this sermon is an attempt. It may be a poor attempt, but it is an attempt at pastoring. It's not really an attempt at preaching. I've preached lots of sermons for the sole purpose of preaching. When I'm invited out to preach a lot, that's what I'm doing. But this Sunday, if you listen to it, this Sunday what you're hearing is pastoring. Mm-hmm. I'm saying something behind the text. I'm saying something behind the words. And what I'm saying is, this really isn't about Sarah. Mm-hmm. This is about new beginnings. Mm-hmm. This is about you. I'm trying to invite these people into this text as a character of this text, mm-hmm. and trying to reimagine the very same God, right, that when he spoke on the first days of creation, and what God said would happen actually happened. That's the same God speaking to a broken womb, this chaos, this wilderness, this emptiness of Sarah's barren womb. The same God that hovers over the wilderness and emptiness of creation is the same God hovering over that barren womb, speaking it into creation, speaking his promises over Sarah and what he said he would do, just like with the stars and the sky and the great light and the sea. When God speaks, life happens. That new beginnings is a subject just like creation and Sarah, and God being the great object that comes to us. In this case, God is both subject and object, but in this case, God speaking to us and calling us into new life, new creation. So what I'm trying to do is a pastoral thing, reminding our people that we're not sole producers of bad things, but instead we're caught up in this God story, and even in the midst of things that are broken and barren, we're in a good place, because what God does with broken and barren things, mm-hmm. is he speaks to them, and when God speaks, new stuff arises. Yes.
Yeah. I love, one of my favorite things that you said something to the effect, like, if we do not believe that God can create out of our formless void, we do not really believe God can create at all. Something to the effect of that. And
I don't remember saying that, but that's good.
Yeah,
I hope I said that.
Yeah, you said something very close to that. It was great. And then for me, that connected to the point where you were talking about your church facilities and the relationship you have with the businesses. Can you speak a little bit about that,
Sure.
and how that you see that as a formless void in your community that God wants to create something out of?
Sure. Well, if you're listening and don't know much about the New Beginning story, I've said some earlier, but when we sold our building, we were able to use the proceeds of that to pay off our debt, and then to buy the strip mall in cash.
Awesome.
So we are people that no longer live in debt at all, which is great and a testimony, but comes with the responsibility of, now we have this 26,000 square foot strip mall. What do we do with it? Well, the pastor that led us there, his name was Shane Ash, one of the most faithful pastors I've ever come to know. Shane's vision was to rent the spaces out to other businesses, nonprofits, organizations, and community that have a conscience that then we could partner with these businesses to produce a common good for the benefit, for the beauty of Lee Summit. I love this. This is real gospel work here. And so our church is just one small component of this. Well, it's not small. We're just one component of this strip mall. But the worship of the church is what's vital. That's not small at all. That's what is driving us. And so every Sunday morning, the strip mall itself is a sermon illustration for every sermon, no matter what topic we're talking about or what text it is. And for us, it's can God do any good thing from 19 or 18 different businesses, organizations, and nonprofits that call Chipman Commons home. Can God do any good thing from that? Well, He can. We have one particular tenant that doesn't express the same kingdom values that we express, and that promote a business that we would not promote. We inherited this contract, not much we can do with it until later on. And so there's, we can play the bad landlord card, just kick them out when their contract's done, okay? Or we can pray for some sort of redemptive activity. And in preaching this message, in the back of my mind is this particular partner, thinking about them, desiring that they use their practice for the economic benefit for all, and for the glory of God's kingdom. And it's a wild thing because they're a franchise and they have lots of different stores and their headquarters is in Mississippi. And yeah, it's a wild dream to think that, but our God's a wild God. And our God has done more with much, much, much less before. And so God can do something here. And so, I hope that answers the question. I kind of rambled a little bit, but I hope that answers the question.
That's great.
Before we move on, could I ask, what is one thing you consistently try to say through almost every sermon that you preach, or something that you're always thinking of? I think I kind of caught the thread in this sermon, but maybe you could just elaborate.
Yeah,
is there something like you want to say to your people every week or something?
Oh,
like
yeah,
that?
100%. So we'll see if we line up. And I think it's not something necessarily that I'm setting out saying I want to say this, as much as it is, this is how God has spoken to me, and no matter where I am, it's what I'm going to say because it's just how God has spoken to me.
Yeah.
So there's probably a few of those things, but God's providence and faithfulness, I feel like that comes out all the time. That God's redemption, God's love for us. Those would be the three immediate things, with the heavy emphasis on God will be faithful. God will do what God said He will do.
Yeah.
I end up saying that in just different ways over and over again. And I think what that does is it creates patience. It creates this place where we can rest. That this story is about God. And if we can rest in God's promises, even in spite of brokenness, or in some stories, even in sin, we can take the pressure really off of this need for right production. How do I need to live Monday through Saturday to make sure I make it back here on Sunday, not feeling guilty, but feeling alive, man? What do I need to produce? Boy, I think God will be faithful in spite of your production. I end up saying that a lot.
Yeah. One of the things.
Hold on, real quick.
Yeah.
What'd you catch?
I caught that you were trying to say that God will be faithful, especially because of the building. Like, them always thinking like, oh man, the building didn't work out like we thought it would work out. So that was the thread I was saying.
That's
but
it.
You know what I mean? Yeah.
That's it.
And I think, not that every church is a little bit different, but maybe some bodies of churches don't need to hear that in that season right now. Well, I mean, I think they always need to hear God is faithful, but there's certain things you may want to emphasize in a certain season of a church, and maybe that's just what you're trying to do throughout your sermons right now. I mean, yeah. So,
sure. Fair.
Yeah.
Fair.
Yeah, that's great. One of the things that you talked about was the idea of the radical freedom of God, and
boy. That's Bergamon. That's Bergamon's fault.
Okay. All right. Tell us, what does that language mean? The radical freedom of God, and I think that's connected to the idea of like where we come to our end, God is free to do whatever God pleases.
Yeah, so there's a question in that text. God asked this question to Sarah: is anything too hard for the Lord? Right? And so Brueggemann writes in his commentary that it's a yes/no question. And so what are the options here? So what if we say yes? Yes, there are things that are too hard. Well, what we do is we deny God's ability to be God. That this world is closed, that it is not open, and that God's not really free to be God. But if the question is no, or the answer is no, there's nothing too hard for the Lord, there's nothing impossible for the Lord, then God is radically free to do anything, like redeem a dilapidated strip mall, or restore a marriage, or create from barrenness, or out of a formless void. Perhaps, and I'm not a scholar in Brueggemann, but perhaps part of Brueggemann's point here is that when we begin to confess through laughter, look at what God has done, that nothing is impossible for the Lord, that it creates a witnessing community. It creates a testimony in the people that have witnessed this act, and the story that forms them and shapes them. Well, it isn't really a story, it's a laughter. It's a joyous laughter of nothing is impossible for God.
That's
Yeah.
awesome. That's awesome.
Could you describe your style of preaching or
Erratic.
okay? Yeah.
Well, maybe, I hope not. Maybe some people would say that. Go ahead. I'm just kidding.
No, yeah. Just describe your style or how you perceive, how you preach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I try to be narrative. I'm informed mostly by Eugene Lowry's homiletical plot, though if you're a homiletician and you listen, you may not recognize it all. But that's informed me. Some of what Andy Stanley has a pretty simple method out there called God, or
Me,
you, God.
God, you, we.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. That's right.
What book is that from? Do you remember? Like,
Oh,
I have it on my phone actually.
Yeah.
because I had it for some class.
So I read that, and I thought it was really simple to get my head around. It made a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
actually, I find myself thinking sometimes a lot in that outline.
Yeah.
And then Paul Scott Wilson's 4 pages as well. And I try to combine sometimes the 4 pages. So if you're not familiar with the 4 pages, there's a problem in the text, there's a problem in the world, there's a solution in the text, then there's a solution in the world. And those are the 4 pages. Sometimes I try to wrap that with the homiletical plot as well, something I learned well, it wasn't taught to me, but an experiment I was allowed to try in undergrad, and has stuck with me all these years. And so, that's what I'm kind of trying to do. But my style is certainly narrative. It's also passionate, and that's just a product of you'll have to ask God why. I don't know. Some people tell me that I remind them of the old evangelistic, like, hellfire and brimstone preachers, though I hope my content is not hellfire and brimstone, but my delivery just real passionate.
Yeah.
I've tried to tone that down several times. It never avails. It never happens. I get too excited and I just get passionate. I a lot of times will call my congregants by name. I just get,
Oh yeah, in your sermon you
Yeah.
did that. Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
going to ask you about that because every once in a while you kept saying
and
people's names.
Yeah, you're
and
wondering
so,
who Rex is. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, Rex
Tell
is
us
a real
about
person.
Why do you do that?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't. Well, I do know because I was in youth ministry.
Oh yeah.
And
Be
people,
quiet.
well, not necessarily that, but people's engagement, they wonder. And so if you're having a
yeah,
conversation with
true.
them and you're talking about by names, and you're inviting them in.
Mhm.
And I feel like probably like I feel like what I'm saying is real. It's true, and it matters. And so I'm just inviting these people into the conversation by literally calling their name, and not to embarrass them. If I see that someone is not paying attention, I try not to, because I'm not out to embarrass them.
Mhm.
This is usually the people that I'm calling are people that are deadlocked.
Okay.
They're very engaged, and I'm just, hey, I'm just having a conversation with real people here. My delivery now is probably not considered very conversational, but I'm just trying to be me.
Yeah.
And I've tried to do the popular thing, and I'm not a popular guy. So it's just me.
Yeah, that's great. So, what were you hoping people's responses to this sermon would be? Did you ask them to do something in particular? Is there something that you're hoping would change in them?
So New Beginnings is we have a more liturgical format of worship, and we do a lot of the same things every single week. And one of those things that we do is that we receive the Eucharist after the sermon. So that was the response and the intended response. Now, sometimes the responses are different, but in this particular, for this particular sermon, it just fell in the word phase of our gathered liturgy, of our fourfold liturgy, and it was to be received as the word. And then as the service moved on, we had a chance to respond in thanksgiving and things through other elements of the service.
Great.
So, what is the primary function of preaching and sermons in your community?
What is the primary function of the preached word of God in my community? Man, that's a convicting question, because I want to say the primary function is to be a word from God. Sometimes I'm an oversharer. I have a feeling it's about to happen. But the way that the preaching moment has been used in New Beginnings over the last little bit, at least, has been one of kind of like vision casting. I think that is a role of the pastor. So if this podcast was about pastoral theology, which if you ever do that, let me know. That's my jam.
Yeah.
But preaching is just one aspect of pastoral theology. And theoretically, I like to think about the preaching moment as something different than the business CEO that's standing in front of the organization, preaching the vision forward. But that is, even as I hear myself talk, that is a part of preaching. I mean, being prophetic,
Mm-hmm.
and that's certainly a powerful part of preaching. And so, to answer your question, I want to say that it's this divine word that creates new life as God speaks. Whenever God speaks, new things are created. I like to think that's what the sermon is, right? But lately, let me give you a couple of responses. Lately, I feel like it's been this one moment in the week that I have a chance to give the vision direction, and so it's this pastoral type of trying to guide my people forward. And that's not a bad thing. It maybe just wasn't my initial expectation of what it would look like.
Mm-hmm.
Now I also want to give an honest response. Thankfully, the sermon that you're asking me about is not one of the bad ones. And there's been bad ones, and they're on podcast. So I am tempted on many Sundays to not load the next podcast, just to keep it offline. But I think it's so disingenuous and not true. And so the bad ones are online. They're there. I can't remember which ones. I try to forget them. But the whole point of bringing that up is that there are some moments that what is the sermon trying to do? What are you trying to do in the preaching moment? What does that mean? What's the purpose of this? There have been Sundays where, unfortunately, either there wasn't enough prayer or there wasn't enough preparation, and the worst thing happened. and the sermon became a place for Jake's thoughts on things. The last thing that my congregation needs is Jake Edwards' thoughts on things. That's the last thing anybody needs. And so that's not what the sermon is to be about. But unfortunately, Lord help us, that has happened. It will never happen again. I hope not.
Amen.
I have a follow-up question. Just when you became pastor of your church, and the whole thing with the building and their disappointment and what they were used to, did you change their taste for sermons, maybe, like, because they had this idea of what a pastor was, I guess, or maybe like what they would do or teach or not say or something like that? And was that hard for your people, or did you just, maybe that's a weird question, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that.
Or was it hard for your people to, like,
I love that question.
come into that?
I think that's an honest question for anyone to ask. It's difficult probably for me to get the full answer. I'll give you one half of the answer.
Yeah.
The other half would have to come from a congregant or congregants. But from my perspective, the answer to your question is, I'm different than the person that I followed. I'm different, and there's been an adaptation there needs to be, I guess, to some case, and that's been good for some. I think not in comparison by any means, but just a different style, and that's been good for some. I think it's been difficult for others. I think I've been accepted by some, and there's been encouraging words, and that's encouraging for me to hear. But then the reality is, there have been some folks that, who is this crazy nut job that keeps calling my name every week, and why does he do that? And doesn't he know I'm not in his youth group, and I'm not a teenager, and why is he preaching to me like a youth pastor? And some of that's because that's what I've been for 10 years, and I'm trying to learn to be something else.
Yeah, that's good. So I want to talk a little bit about some personal reflection after this sermon. How did this sermon, this text, maybe the preparation of it, transform you? How did it shape your heart and your mind and your spirit?
It gave me hope. It gave me hope that some of the things that I'm frustrated about, that I'll one day laugh. And so it certainly was a word to me. Michael Pasquarello, maybe it's Michael Pasquarello III, he writes a book called, I think this is right, Speak Because We've First Been Spoken. And we don't have a word for our congregations until it is formed and shaped within us and becomes a word that is spoken to us and through us, and we become that. And I think in a real way that's what this text, that's what it did in me. It shaped me, it formed me. I became a testimony of hope that the God who did deliver on his promise for Sarah is the same God in process of delivering the promises in my life. Maybe he's already delivered and I just haven't seen it yet, and I'm coming to the point to testify, to bear witness. And so then I was able to stand in front of my people, not only as a preacher, but someone who was excited to bear witness to the hope. Can you believe it? One day we're going to laugh with joy. And so that's a very I think you hear that in the sermon. That's a very genuine place. You hear that because I've come to the point to genuinely be excited to one day we're going to laugh, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which that takes us right into my next question for you, which is, in the coming days of New Beginnings, how do you hope this text, this sermon, the message that was shared, will shape your community's lived ecclesiology? So how they relate to one another, how they relate to their community. How do you hope that this text will inform all that?
Hope.
Yeah.
I hope I hope that it will inform them to be people of hope and of patience, those rooted in a promise, looking forward to live prophetically. This isn't about them. This is about God. So be bold. Be bold in action. Relax. Let your hair down. and know that this whole thing ends in laughter. You know.
Yeah.
Well, Jake, thanks for being on our podcast. We really count it as a privilege to have you.
Oh yeah, no kidding, man. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you so much.